Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into how environmental economics is literally reshaping everything around us, from the mechanics of massive global markets right down to our own local communities. We're going to unpack the research, the hard data, and the economic theories to figure out how our world is adapting to the ultimate challenge. How do we sustain human prosperity on a planet that has strict physical limits?
So, let's jump right in. Look at this. Over the last 3 decades alone, global GDP has grown a staggering 6 times over. Now that's an economic boom that has lifted millions out of poverty and massively increased the average human lifespan. But, well, here's the catch. This massive growth has relied almost entirely on the unsustainable depletion of Earth's finite resources. We're essentially running on strategies that simply are not viable anymore. So how on earth do we fix it?
Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, the cost of infinite growth. Second, big brands go green. Third, the push for green jobs. Fourth, enter the circular economy. And finally, number 5, capitalism X.0, a new path.
Starting off with Section 1, the cost of infinite growth and why we are rethinking traditional economic models.
It all really boils down to this one fundamental question. Can we actually achieve infinite growth on a finite planet? It's pretty much the core conflict of our era. On one hand, we've got a constantly skyrocketing human demand for energy, food, and consumer goods. But on the other hand, our planet has a strictly limited ecological capacity. As the sources point out, we simply cannot support today's explosive growth using yesterday's outdated policies.
This clash of perspectives is super important to grasp. The standard economic model largely assumes that infinite growth is totally possible. It suggests that environmental harm can just be decoupled from progress, basically viewing nature mostly as a simple resource extraction cost. But ecological economics tells a much harder truth. It argues that all human economic activity is undeniably bound by the finite biophysical systems of the natural world. Basically, greater economic throughput inevitably translates to more waste.
Interestingly enough, critiques of that standard model come from all across the ideological spectrum. As we impartially review the source material, we see a bunch of different schools of thought pointing out fatal flaws in mainstream assumptions. For example, Marxists highlight that capitalist growth inherently requires relentless resource extraction and creates periodic crises. But then, on a completely different end of the spectrum, Austrian economics warns that artificial, stimulative monetary policies and government bailouts just encourage toxic boom and bust cycles. And of course, ecological economics emphasizes that we literally cannot ignore environmental limitations. The big consensus from all these totally diverse perspectives, the standard model is definitely missing a few pieces.
To perfectly ground these theories in reality, let's look at a pretty wild, though tragic, historical example: the island of Nauru. Back in 1798, it was discovered by the British and dubbed a beautiful little island. But it had one highly valuable asset: rich phosphate deposits. So mining began in the late 1800s. Post-independence, between 1968 and 1980, they were extracting a massive 1.8 million metric tons a year, chasing relentless economic growth. But it was a finite resource. By 2004, the phosphate was virtually exhausted, exports plummeted to just 22,000 tons, and the entire economy collapsed. Today, it stands as a stark, cautionary tale. It perfectly illustrates the ultimate dead end of an economy built solely on the relentless extraction of a finite resource.
Moving on to Section 2, Big Brands Go Green. Let's look at the rise of ecobusiness.
Did you know that Coca-Cola is actually the #1 global purchaser of both aluminum and sugarcane? Yeah, and they're also the second largest purchaser of glass. This brilliantly illustrates a really important point. Massive, multinational corporations often have a much more direct, immediate environmental impact than entire national governments do. A single supply chain decision by a giant brand like that, it can literally change global commodity practices overnight. And that leads us directly to the core motivation behind this shift, perfectly captured in this quote from Walmart's Beth Keck. She says, "Sustainability is a business strategy, not a charitable giving strategy." Ecobusiness really isn't about charity, folks. For the Fortune 500, sustainability is a core mechanism for corporate growth. It's all about cutting energy costs, minimizing packaging, avoiding supply chain risks, and protecting their revenues against really volatile commodity prices. They sustain their profits first, which in turn ends up scaling massive environmental benefits.
But it's not always a super smooth transition. Consider this phenomenon, called pilot paralysis. Our sources show a fascinating dissonance here.
72% of European consumers say they want green products, but very few actually buy them if the price isn't right. Because of high upfront costs and incredibly complex supply chains, a lot of corporate eco-initiatives look fantastic in a small test phase, but then completely stall out before ever reaching the mass market. The reality is, if sustainable products aren't competitively priced, they just don't scale.
That brings us to Section 3, the push for green jobs. We're looking at macro-level policy and energy transitions.
Okay, we need to clarify exactly what policymakers actually mean when they talk about a green economy. As defined by the EU's foundational strategies, it's a systemic approach. So it's not just about passing a few environmental laws here and there. It combines long-term ecological sustainability with fiscal policies that are designed to actively create brand new, non-polluting industries and jobs. The EU's ultimate goal? To cut emissions by up to 80% by 2050, all while remaining globally economically competitive.
But to really understand the sheer scale of this ambition, we have to look at the baseline reality. Back in 2011, the EU's energy mix was completely dominated by solid fuels, nuclear power, and gases. Renewables were holding at just 21%. Transforming this means entirely replacing centuries-old, centralized fossil fuel infrastructure with decentralized, clean energy grids. It is an absolutely monumental task.
However, the economic upside here is absolutely massive. Hard data from the Center for European Policy Studies projects that a high adoption rate of renewable energy isn't going to kill the economy, it's actually going to supercharge it. We're talking 800,000 new jobs by 2020, 1.3 million by 2030, and a staggering 3.7 million high-quality jobs by 2050. Transitioning away from carbon is consistently proving to be a massive net positive for employment.
Next up is Section 4, Enter the Circular Economy, focusing on SMEs and sustainable processes. So the circular economy entirely replaces that old wasteful make, use, dispose linear model we're all used to. Instead, it keeps materials in a continuous productive loop through three main steps. First up, reduce. You minimize your raw resources and toxic materials right at the design phase. Second, reuse and repair. You intentionally design your products so they actually last longer and can be easily taken apart. And third, upcycle. You take leftover waste materials and ingeniously transform them into brand new products. It's like a giant puzzle where every single piece gets reused. To make this a bit more concrete, let's look at two brilliant, real-world small and medium-sized enterprises featured in our sources. First, there's Fairphone out of the Netherlands. They build electronics using conflict-free minerals and a highly repairable design, which drastically cuts down on e-waste and supply chain exploitation. Then there's OS Design in Estonia. They take leftover, discarded fabric from massive Bangladeshi garment factories and mass upcycle it into new clothing. This directly reduces landfill waste, water usage, and the demand for pesticides used in growing new cotton. It's just an incredibly smart, agile way of doing business.
And finally, Section 5, Capitalism X.0, a new path. Let's talk about empowering local communities.
So we kind of have to acknowledge a tough reality here. Despite decades of top-down global treaties, massive UN initiatives, and corporate ESG programs, carbon dioxide levels have unfortunately just continued to rise. Why is that? Well, it's largely because massive institutions often find themselves completely entangled in bureaucratic red tape, fragmented missions, and deeply competing geopolitical interests. Global cooperation at that scale has just proven incredibly difficult to execute effectively. And this perfectly illustrates a necessary shift in how we approach innovation. Traditionally, we've always relied on big science, highly institutionalized, entangled with large global industries, and driven by market monopolies. But going forward, our sources point to the immense potential of little science. This is community-based, highly collaborative, and it directly integrates cutting-edge technical advancements with the specific, localized ecological needs of a community. It's nimble, real-time problem-solving.
Researchers are actually calling this emergence Capitalism X.0. Think of it as a much-needed evolution of the market. It actually returns to Adam Smith's original vision, where private profit and public community interests are properly balanced. Instead of relying on vulnerable and sometimes exploitative global supply chains, Capitalism X.0 champions resilient, community-based production, leveraging awesome technologies like 3D printing and local networks. It ensures that economic prosperity is directly aligned with local ecological responsibility. The solutions are built right where the people actually live.
So here's a thought to leave you with. If massive global institutions and top-down treaties can't entirely save the planet on their own, the ultimate responsibility and the ultimate power shifts directly into our hands. So are you ready to rethink your own economic footprint? Are you ready to help build these sustainable circular solutions right in your own community?